There was a time when I believed love meant giving everything, everything. Your time, your dreams, your patience, your forgiveness. And if you loved deeply enough, sincerely enough, someone would eventually see your heart and choose to stay. I know now that love doesn't work that way. But back then, I was the kind of girl who believed it did. My name isn't important. What matters is the story. Because somewhere out there, another girl is living the same story right now, loving someone who quietly stopped loving her a long time ago. And maybe hearing what happened to me will help her find her way back to herself. I met him on a warm evening that smelled like rain and dust. It was one of those evenings when the sky turns orange just before the streetlights flicker on. I remember holding a cup of chai, laughing with friends, when he walked into the cafe. Tall, calm, confident. The kind of confidence that makes a room subtly shift when someone enters. He smiled at the waiter, then glanced around the cafe, and for a brief moment his eyes met mine. Just a second, but something about that moment stayed with me. Later that night, my friend nudged my shoulder. "Hey," she whispered, "that guy has been looking at you." I rolled my eyes. Stop. But I glanced again, and he was looking. Not intensely, not in a creepy way, just curious, like he wanted to know who I was. 2 weeks later, we officially met through mutual friends. His name was Arjun. He had an easy laugh and the kind of voice that made you feel calm when he spoke. At first, everything felt effortless. We talked for hours about small things, music, childhood memories, the places we wanted to travel someday. I remember one evening when we sat on a quiet terrace watching the city lights flicker below us. The air smelled like jasmine from a nearby balcony. He turned to me and said softly, "You're different." I laughed. "Different how?" He shrugged. "You actually listen when people talk." That simple sentence warmed something inside my chest, because listening was something I had always done. I cared about people. I remembered details. I noticed when someone seemed tired or quiet. And for the first time, someone noticed that about me. Those early months felt like walking through sunlight. Good morning messages, late night calls, random walks through crowded markets where he'd suddenly grab my hand to pull me through the crowd. He'd tease me about how much I loved street food. "You're going to make me addicted to pani puri," he joked once. "You're welcome," I said proudly. He laughed and looked at me in that soft way people look when they're starting to fall for someone. Or at least, that's what I thought. The truth is, sometimes love begins beautifully even when it's not meant to last. But you don't know that at the beginning. At the beginning, everything feels like destiny. One night, he asked me something that stayed with me for years. We were sitting on his bike near a quiet lake outside the city. The moon reflected on the water like silver glass. He suddenly asked, "Why do you trust people so easily?" I thought for a moment. Then I said, "Because I'd rather be kind and get hurt than be cold and miss something beautiful." He looked at me for a long time after that. "Girls like you," he said quietly, "don't exist much anymore." I smiled. But inside my chest, my heart was already choosing him, completely. What I didn't realize was that loving someone deeply doesn't guarantee they'll value it. Sometimes they simply get used to it. Slowly, very slowly, small things began to change. Not in a dramatic way, just little shifts. At first, he stopped replying quickly to messages. Then our long calls became shorter. Then he began canceling plans more often. "Work is crazy. Friends need me tonight. Let's meet another day." I understood. Or at least I told myself I understood. Love makes you patient. Too patient sometimes. One evening, I waited nearly 2 hours at a cafe where we were supposed to meet. The waiter kept glancing at me kindly. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. Finally, a message appeared. Sorry, something came up. Rain check? No apology call, no explanation, just that. I stared at the message for a long time while the cafe slowly emptied around me. Something inside me felt small. But when he called the next day and joked about something random, I laughed like everything was fine, because I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be the girl who complained. So I kept loving him the same way, fully, openly, patiently. But there's a dangerous thing about unconditional love. If the wrong person receives it, they start believing you'll never leave, no matter how little they give. Months passed. The warmth he once showed me became occasional, like sunlight through clouds. Sometimes he'd be affectionate again, holding my hand, telling me he missed me, and those small moments would erase weeks of distance. I kept thinking, maybe things will go back to how they were. Maybe he's just stressed. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe love requires patience. But deep inside, a quiet voice had started whispering. Something wasn't right. One night, everything became painfully clear. We were at a party hosted by a mutual friend. Music played loudly, people laughed, glasses clinked together. I was talking with a few friends when I noticed Arjun across the room. He stood close to another girl. Too close. She touched his arm. He leaned towards her as she whispered something. They both laughed. And the way he looked at her, I recognized that look. It was the same look he once gave me. My stomach twisted. For a moment, I told myself I was imagining things. But then he put his hand gently on her back, the same small gesture he used when guiding me through crowds. A simple gesture, but one that meant intimacy, familiarity, comfort. My chest tightened. I walked outside to the balcony where the night air was cool and quiet. Cars moved like tiny lights far below. My heart was beating loudly in my ears. After a few minutes, he stepped outside. "Hey," he said casually, "why'd you disappear?" I looked at him carefully, and for the first time in our relationship, I asked a direct question. "Who is she?" He frowned slightly. "Who?" "The girl you were talking to." "Oh," he shrugged. "Just a friend." Just a friend. 3 words that can mean 1,000 different things. I nodded slowly, but something inside me had shifted. Not broken, just awakened. Because in that moment, I realized something painful. He wasn't afraid of losing me, not even a little. He believed I would always be there, waiting, understanding, forgiving, loving him the same way no matter what. And the most heartbreaking part, at that time, he was right. But life has a strange way of changing people, and sometimes the girl who once loved you the most becomes the one who finally walks away. Not because she stopped caring, but because she finally started caring about herself. And the day that change began, neither of us realized it yet. But years later, he would, painfully. Because the girl he thought would crave him forever would become the woman he couldn't reach anymore. And that's when the real story begins. After that night at the party, something inside me changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. It wasn't the kind of change that makes you storm out of someone's life or slam doors behind you. It was quieter than that. Like the moment just before sunrise, when the sky begins to lighten but the sun hasn't appeared yet. A quiet awareness, a feeling I couldn't ignore anymore. For weeks after that party, I found myself noticing things I used to overlook. The way he looked at his phone when we were together, the way he sometimes seemed distracted when I talked, the way our conversations had become shallow compared to the deep talks we once shared. Before, I had explained these things away. He's tired, he's busy, he's stressed. But now I simply watched. And when you stop explaining someone's behavior and just observe it, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. One evening, we met for dinner after nearly 2 weeks of not seeing each other. 2 weeks! In the beginning of our relationship, 2 days without seeing each other felt long. But now, 2 weeks had somehow become normal. We sat across from each other in a small restaurant filled with soft yellow lights and the smell of roasted spices. He scrolled through his phone while I spoke. "Work has been exhausting," I said. He replied, barely looking up. I paused. The old version of me would have continued talking, but this time I stopped. After a moment, he noticed the silence and looked up. "What?" I smiled gently. "Nothing." But inside my chest, something had quietly fallen out of place. You see, when you truly love someone, their attention feels like warmth. And when that warmth disappears, you feel the cold. Not suddenly, but slowly. Later that night, as he dropped me home on his bike, the wind rushed past us and the city lights blurred together. I wrapped my arms around him like I always did. But something felt different. For the first time since we met, I didn't feel safe in that hug. I felt alone. A few days later, my best friend Mira came over. She had known me since childhood, the kind of friend who could read my face before I spoke a single word. We sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by snacks and old photos. She studied me carefully. "Okay," she said finally. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I replied automatically. She raised one eyebrow. "Don't lie to me. Your eyes look sad." I sighed. Then I told her everything. The distance, the girl at the party, the way things had slowly changed. Mira listened quietly. When I finished, she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you feel loved?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out, because for the first time, I didn't know. That silence said more than any explanation. Mira reached over and squeezed my hand. "You deserve someone who chooses you every day," she said softly, "not someone who treats you like an option." Her words lingered in the air long after she left. For days afterward, I kept thinking about that question. Do you feel loved? And the more I thought about it, the clearer the answer became. No, I felt tolerated. I felt convenient, but loved? Not anymore. Yet leaving wasn't easy. When you've built memories with someone, your heart clings to the good moments. I remembered our first long walk through the city, the night we watched the stars near the lake, the way he used to call me just to hear my voice. Those memories felt like anchors pulling me back. Maybe the old version of him would return. Maybe we were just going through a phase. Maybe if I loved him better, things would change. But deep down, another voice whispered something painful. Love should not feel like begging. Weeks turned into months, and our relationship continued in that strange in-between space. Not fully broken, but no longer whole. He still called sometimes, still asked to meet occasionally, still acted affectionate once in a while, just enough to keep me hoping, just enough to keep me staying. Then one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting in a small park near my office during lunch break. Children were running around, chasing pigeons. An elderly couple sat nearby, sharing roasted peanuts and laughing quietly together. I watched them for a while. The man gently brushed a leaf off the woman's shoulder. Such a small gesture, but it was filled with care, effort, attention. That moment hit me harder than I expected, because I realized something. Real love doesn't disappear when life gets busy. Real love shows up even in the smallest moments. And suddenly, I understood something I had been avoiding. Arjun hadn't stopped loving me overnight. He had simply stopped trying, and somewhere along the way, I had accepted less than I deserved. That evening, he called me. "Hey," he said casually, "want to meet tonight?"
His voice sounded normal, relaxed, as if nothing between us had changed. For a moment, I almost said yes automatically. But then I remembered the elderly couple in the park, the quiet tenderness between them, and the sudden clarity inside my chest. I took a slow breath. "Not tonight," I said. There was a small pause. "Busy?" I hesitated. Then I answered honestly. "No, I just don't feel like it." Another pause, this time longer. "Okay," he said eventually. His voice sounded slightly confused, because probably I had never said no before. That small moment might not seem important, but it was the first time I chose myself instead of choosing him. And once that door opens, it's impossible to close again. Over the next few weeks, I started focusing on things I had neglected for months. I spent more time with friends. I started reading again. I went on early morning walks and watched the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. Little by little, my world expanded beyond him, and something surprising began to happen. The more I filled my life with other things, the less power he had over my happiness. One evening, I noticed something strange. Hours had passed without me thinking about him, not because I was forcing myself to forget, but because I was simply living. And that realization felt like breathing fresh air after being in a closed room for too long. But Arjun noticed the change too. Of course he did, because when someone who once gave you endless attention suddenly stops chasing, you feel it. He started calling more often, messaging more, asking when we could meet. At first, I responded politely, but the dynamic between us had already shifted. Before, I waited for him. Now he was waiting for me, and he didn't like that feeling, not one bit. One night, he finally asked the question that had been building for weeks. "Are you mad at me?" We were talking on the phone. I looked out my window at the quiet street below. "No," I said calmly. "Then why are you acting so distant?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered with the truth. "I think I just stopped trying so hard." Silence filled the line, because sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to hear. He laughed awkwardly. "You're overthinking things." Maybe, but for the first time in a long time, my heart felt steady, because the girl who once waited endlessly for his attention was slowly becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone calmer, someone who no longer needed to chase love. And Arjun hadn't realized it yet, but the moment a woman stops chasing you, the story begins to change. Soon he would start noticing what he had taken for granted: the patience, the warmth, the loyalty. The way I once looked at him like he was the center of my world, and by the time he truly understood what he lost, it would be already too late.
Something strange happens when you stop chasing someone. They start running toward you. Not always because they suddenly love you more. Sometimes it's simply because they feel your absence, your attention, your warmth, your availability. And when that constant presence disappears, it unsettles them. That's exactly what began happening with Arjun. For months, I had been the one adjusting my life around him, waiting for his messages, making time whenever he asked, excusing every late reply, every canceled plan, every moment of distance. But once I stepped back, the balance quietly shifted, and he felt it immediately. It started with small things. More frequent texts. "Good morning. Have you eaten? What are you doing tonight?" At first, I responded normally, but I no longer dropped everything to talk. Sometimes I replied hours later, sometimes the next day. Not out of revenge, not to play games, but because I was actually busy living my life again. One evening, he called me 3 times. I was at dinner with Mira and a few friends, laughing harder than I had laughed in months. My phone buzzed on the table. Arjun calling. I looked at the screen for a moment, then flipped the phone over. Mira noticed. "Aren't you going to answer?" I shook my head. "I'll call him later." She smiled slightly. That small moment may seem insignificant, but months earlier, I would have stepped outside immediately to take that call, because somewhere inside me I had believed his attention was rare, something precious I needed to hold on to. Now it simply felt normal. And when something becomes normal, it stops controlling you. Later that night, I returned his call. He answered instantly. "Where were you?" he asked. "With friends." "Oh." He sounded slightly surprised. I could almost picture the expression on his face. "Anyway," he continued, "I was thinking we should meet tomorrow." I thought about my schedule. "I can't tomorrow." "Why?" "I already have plans." Another pause. "What plans?" I smiled softly at the ceiling. "Just life," I said. He didn't laugh, because something in his mind had begun to shift. For the first time since we met, I wasn't easily available. A few days later, we finally met for coffee. When I walked into the cafe, he was already there. But instead of casually leaning back like he usually did, he stood up immediately, almost nervously. "Hey," he said. His eyes studied my face carefully, as if he were searching for something that used to be there. I sat down across from him. For a moment, we just looked at each other. The silence felt different now. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. "You look different," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" He shrugged. "I don't know." But I knew. He wasn't talking about my appearance. He was noticing the energy, the calmness, the absence of that old, eager warmth I once showed him. We talked about normal things, work, friends, life. But I noticed something interesting. For the first time since we met, he was the one asking most of the questions. "What have you been doing lately? Who did you go out with last weekend? Why didn't you tell me you started painting again?" I smiled slightly because the answers were simple. I had always been this person. He just hadn't paid attention before. Halfway through the conversation, he suddenly leaned forward. "Did I do something wrong?" His voice sounded sincere. For a moment, I considered giving him a detailed explanation, telling him about every time I felt ignored, every time he canceled plans, every moment I felt like an afterthought. But then I realized something important. People who truly value you don't need long explanations. They notice your pain before it becomes silence. So I simply said, "I think we just grew apart." He frowned. "That's not true." I didn't argue. Sometimes the truth takes time to sink in. After coffee, we walked outside. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of street food and distant rain. We stopped near his bike. Normally, this was the moment when he'd hug me, maybe kiss my forehead before dropping me home. But this time, we just stood there. Then he said something unexpected. "You used to miss me more." The honesty of that statement almost made me laugh. "I probably did," I admitted. "And now?" I looked at him carefully. "I think I just miss myself more." That sentence landed heavily between us, because he understood what it meant. For the first time since we met, he was no longer the center of my emotional world. Over the next few weeks, his behavior changed more noticeably. He started initiating plans again. He complimented me more. He even showed up unexpectedly once at my office with coffee, something he had never done before. 6 months ago, that gesture would have made my heart explode with happiness, but now it simply made me smile politely. "Thank you," I said, but inside, I felt calm, not overwhelmed, not hopeful, just peaceful. And that calmness confused him more than anything else, because he remembered the girl who once lit up every time he saw him, the girl who laughed at all his jokes, the girl who waited patiently for his attention. But that girl was slowly disappearing, not because she stopped loving deeply, but because she finally started loving herself too. One evening, we sat together watching the sunset from a small hill overlooking the city. The sky burned orange and purple, and the buildings below looked tiny from that height. It reminded me of the night we first came here months ago. Back then, I had leaned against him, believing we were building something lasting.
Now I simply sat beside him, peaceful, independent, complete on my own. After a long silence, he spoke quietly. "You're slipping away from me." I didn't answer immediately, because in some ways he was right. But the truth was more complicated than that. I wasn't slipping away. I was simply returning to myself. Finally, I said softly, "I was never supposed to disappear inside someone else." He looked at me, confusion and regret slowly appearing in his eyes, but the realization was arriving too late, because the woman sitting beside him now was no longer the girl who would crave him forever. And soon he would understand something painful. When someone finally stops chasing you, you start noticing all the ways they once loved you. Every small effort, every act of patience, every quiet sacrifice. And by the time you realize how rare that love was, it's already gone. Arjun was just beginning to feel that loss, but he didn't yet know how deep it would become, because the next chapter of our story would change everything between us.
After that afternoon, something unusual happened between Arjun and me. There were no dramatic fights, no angry messages, no emotional goodbyes, just silence. A quiet space that slowly grew wider between us. At first, it felt strange. For nearly 2 years, he had been part of my daily routine. Even when things weren't perfect, there were still messages, calls, small interactions that kept us connected. Now, suddenly, there was nothing. And that silence felt heavy at first, like the quiet after a storm. The first few days were the hardest. I would instinctively reach for my phone in the morning, expecting to see his name. Then I would remember, and slowly place the phone back down. Not with sadness, just with a small sigh of adjustment. Because letting go isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's simply learning to live without habits that once defined your days. A week passed. Then 2. My life continued. Work, friends, long walks in the evening, coffee shops filled with quiet music and the smell of roasted beans. I began doing small things that made me feel like myself again. I started painting in the evenings, bright colors spreading across blank canvases, sunsets, mountains, little scenes that reminded me of calm places inside my mind. It felt good, creative, free. One Sunday morning, I went hiking with Mira. We climbed a small hill just outside the city where wild grass moved gently in the wind. At the top, we sat watching the horizon stretch endlessly in front of us. The sky was clear blue, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Mira looked at me carefully. "You seem lighter," she said. I smiled. "I think I am." Because somewhere along the way, the heaviness that had once lived inside my chest had slowly disappeared. Not overnight, but little by little, like clouds drifting away from the sun. 3 weeks after our conversation, my phone buzzed late one night. I glanced at the screen. Arjun. For a moment, I simply stared at the name. The old version of me would have answered immediately, but now I felt calm, curious. I answered. "Hello?" His voice sounded softer than usual. "Hey." A pause. Then he said something unexpected. "I just wanted to hear your voice." The sentence felt strangely nostalgic. Once, hearing those words would have made my heart race. Now they simply felt distant. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied. Another pause followed. Then he spoke again. "I've been thinking about us." Of course he had, because silence has a powerful way of making people reflect. When someone who once filled your life disappears, your mind begins replaying every memory, every moment, every mistake. "What about us?" I asked gently. "I think I didn't appreciate you enough." His voice sounded heavy, full of the kind of realization that arrives too late. I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I looked out my window at the quiet street below, streetlights glowing softly against the darkness, life continuing peacefully. I know, I said calmly. The honesty of that answer seemed to surprise him. You're not even angry, he said. I was, I admitted, but anger is heavy to carry for too long. Another silence. Then he asked something that revealed exactly where his mind had gone. Are you seeing someone? The question came out quickly, almost nervously. I smiled slightly. No. His relief was almost audible through the phone. Oh. But then I added something that made the moment more complicated. I'm just focusing on myself right now. And that sentence seemed to confuse him, because many people assume you only move on when someone new appears. But the truth is, sometimes you move on simply by rediscovering your own life. I miss you, he said quietly. There it was, the sentence he once said easily when we first started dating, but now it carried a different weight. Regret, longing, realization. For a moment, memories flooded my mind. Our first walk through the city, late-night chai at roadside stalls, the night by the lake when he called me different. Those moments had been real. They had meant something. But memories are like photographs, beautiful to look at, impossible to step back into. I hope you're doing well, I said sincerely. I am, he replied. Then he added softly, but things feel emptier. His honesty touched something inside me, because I knew exactly why he felt that way. When someone gives you consistent love, care, and attention for a long time, their absence leaves a noticeable space, and he was finally feeling that space. Sometimes, he continued slowly, I think about how patient you were with me. I didn't answer, because he didn't need reassurance anymore. He just needed to face the truth. I guess I thought you would always stay, he admitted. That sentence echoed the same belief he had confessed weeks earlier, and it revealed something many people quietly assume. They believe the people who love them deeply will never leave, no matter how little effort they give, no matter how long they neglect the relationship. But every heart has a limit, even the most loyal ones. I stayed as long as I could, I said gently. My voice wasn't bitter, just honest. And when I realized I was losing myself, I had to choose differently. He didn't argue, because somewhere deep inside he knew it was true. After a few more minutes of quiet conversation, the call slowly came to an end. Take care, he said. You too. When the line disconnected, I placed the phone on the table and sat quietly for a moment. There were no tears, no overwhelming emotions, just a calm understanding. Our story had reached its natural ending. But what I didn't realize yet was that Arjun's realization was still growing, because sometimes the full weight of losing someone doesn't hit immediately. It arrives slowly, in quiet moments. When you hear a song that reminds you of them, when you visit places you once shared, when you realize the person who understood you best is no longer part of your life. And months later, he would understand something even more painful. The girl he once believed would crave him forever had truly moved on, not with another man, but with herself. And that kind of loss is the hardest one to accept.
After that late-night call, something inside me settled for good. It wasn't closure in the dramatic movie sense. There were no tears falling on the floor, no long goodbye letters, just a quiet understanding. The chapter had ended, and life was opening a new page. The weeks that followed felt strangely peaceful. I began waking up early again, something I had stopped doing during the emotional exhaustion of the past year. Morning sunlight would spill across my room, turning the walls golden. I would make coffee, sit by the window, and watch the city slowly wake up. Vendors opening stalls, scooters humming through narrow streets, children walking to school with oversized backpacks. Small, ordinary moments that reminded me how big life really is when it doesn't revolve around one person. For a long time, I had unknowingly made Arjun the center of my world. My happiness depended on his attention, my mood depended on his messages, my plans depended on his availability. And when someone lives that way long enough, they slowly forget how to exist independently. But now I was remembering, piece by piece. One evening, Mira dragged me to a small art event downtown, local artists displaying their work in a cozy gallery filled with warm lights and soft music. Paintings covered the walls, landscapes, portraits, abstract colors that looked like emotions spilled across canvas. As we walked through the room, Mira nudged me. "You should show your paintings here someday." I laughed. "My messy sunset paintings?" "They're not messy," she said seriously. "They're full of feeling." Her words stayed with me longer than she probably realized, because for the first time in months, someone was seeing me again. Not as someone's girlfriend, not as someone waiting for love, but simply as me. That night, when I returned home, I pulled out my painting supplies. Blank canvas, fresh colors, the smell of paint filling the room, and for hours I lost myself in creating something new. Brush strokes flowing without thinking, bright orange fading into purple, tiny birds flying across a glowing sky. When I finally stepped back and looked at the painting, I smiled, because it wasn't perfect, but it was alive, just like I was starting to feel again. Life slowly began filling itself with new rhythms: weekend hikes, coffee with friends, long phone calls with my parents, movie nights that ended with laughter instead of emotional exhaustion. And the most surprising part? Arjun crossed my mind less and less, not because I was forcing myself to forget him, but because my life was finally expanding again. 3 months passed, 3 quiet, steady months. Then something unexpected happened. I was walking through a weekend street market filled with colorful stalls and the smell of roasted corn. People moved everywhere, bargaining, laughing, children running between vendors. I stopped at a small stall selling handmade bracelets. As I examined one with tiny blue beads, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Hi." My body froze for a second. Slowly, I turned around. Arjun, standing a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt strange seeing him unexpectedly after so much time. He looked the same calm expression, same quiet confidence, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a softness there now, a kind of quiet searching. "You look good," he said politely. "Thanks," I smiled. "And happy." That observation made me pause, because he was right. "I am," I admitted. We stood there awkwardly for a moment as people walked around us. Then he gestured toward a nearby chai stall. "Do you have time for chai?" For a second, I considered saying no, but something inside me felt calm enough to accept. "Okay." We stood side by side near the stall while the vendor poured steaming chai into small cups. The smell of ginger and cardamom filled the air. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't think I'd run into you like this." "Neither did I." He studied my face carefully. "You seem different." I laughed softly. "You said that before." "Yes," he admitted, "but now I understand what I meant." "And what's that?" He took a sip of chai before answering. "You seem peaceful." The word landed gently between us. Peaceful. It was the exact feeling I had been discovering over the past few months, a calm sense of self that didn't depend on anyone else's attention. "How have you been?" I asked. He hesitated slightly. "Honestly? Yes. I've been thinking a lot."
I didn't respond, so he continued. About us. Of course he had, because time has a way of revealing the full weight of past choices. I started noticing things, he said slowly. Like what? All the ways you used to care for me. His voice sounded thoughtful. The little things I ignored. He looked down at his cup. The way you remembered everything I liked. The way you always checked if I got home safely. The way you stayed patient even when I didn't deserve it. Hearing those memories spoken aloud felt strangely distant, like he was describing a girl I used to be, not the woman standing here now. I took that love for granted, he said quietly. I know. He looked up quickly. You don't even sound angry. I'm not. And I truly wasn't, because anger fades once understanding replaces it. Do you ever think about what could have been? He asked. The question lingered in the air. I thought carefully before answering. Sometimes. Memories don't disappear completely, but they don't control you anymore either. He nodded slowly. I wish I had realized things sooner. His voice carried genuine regret, but regret, unfortunately, can't rewrite the past. The tea vendor began packing up nearby. Evening sunlight painted the sky orange. Our small moment together was ending naturally. I'm glad you're doing well, he said sincerely. And I'm glad you're learning, I replied. He smiled slightly at that. Learning the hard way. Sometimes those are the only lessons people truly remember. We finished our tea and stepped away from the stall. For a brief moment, we stood there like two people who once shared a deep story but had now reached different chapters of life. Then he said something quietly. You really don't crave me anymore, do you? The question held vulnerability, curiosity, a little sadness. I looked at him gently and answered with the simplest truth I had discovered. No, but I do wish you well. That answer seemed to settle something inside him. He nodded slowly. I guess that's fair. We said goodbye. No drama, no lingering looks, just two people walking in different directions through a crowded market. And as I walked away, I realized something powerful. I wasn't walking away from love. I was walking toward a life where love would never require me to lose myself again. Meanwhile, somewhere behind me, Arjun was finally understanding what he had lost. And sometimes that realization stays with a person for the rest of their life.